أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. This is our 12th episode into Introduction to Rijal Studies. In the last episode, we discussed Maraseel ibn Abi Umayr, whether we can rely on the narrations of Ibn Abi Umayr and his two friends, Safwan ibn Yahya and Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Nasr al-Bazanti, when they don't tell us who their source is. Shaykh al-Tusi in Al-Udda, he claimed that the Shia, the school of thought, they consider the narrations of Ibn Abi Umayr, and his two friends, whether they tell us their source or they don't tell us their source. They consider them the same. Why? And this is the pivotal statement, that Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr and his two friends, Safwan ibn Yahya and al-Bazanti, they only rely on trustworthy sources. Here we benefit a mass authentication. Here we could say that anyone whom Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr or Safwan or al-Bazanti rely on, that means that person is trustworthy. Even if Najashi doesn't tell us he's trustworthy, or Shaykh al-Tusi tell us specifically, if Shaykh al-Tusi doesn't tell us specifically that person is reliable, but because Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr relied on him in mentioning a narration, that means we could rely on that source. And here comes the mass authentication. So this is what we discussed in the last episode. This theory, the theory of Hujjiyat Maraseel ibn Abi Umayr, it's one of the most controversial theories in Ilm al-Rijal. There are some who rejected and there are some who accepted. I will briefly mention the names of those who accepted, a brief history of this theory, who accepted this theory and who didn't. I will begin with those who accepted. Sayyid Ali bin Tawus in Al-Falah al-Sa'il, he accepts. Al-Muhaqqiq al-Hilli in his book Al-Mu'tabar, he accepts this theory. Al-Fadil al-Abi in his book Kashf al-Rumuz, Al-Alamat al-Hilli in his book Al-Nihaya, Amid al-Din al-Hilli, he accepts this theory. Al-Shahid al-Awwal in his book Al-Dhikra, Ibn Fahd al-Hilli in his book Al-Muhadhab al-Bara', Al-Muhaqqiq al-Thani أي الكركي in his book جامع المقاصد, الشهيد الثاني in his دراية, الميرزا الاسترابادي in his منهج المقال, الشيخ البهائي in his شرح الفقيه, a commentary on من لا يحضره الفقيه, الشيخ عبد النبي in his book تكملة نقد الرجال, المير داماد in his الرواشح, الوحيد البهبهاني, الشيخ مهدي الشيرازي الكجوري, and last but not least Sayyid al-Sistani and his son Sayyid Muhammad Rida al-Sistani. These scholars, they all accept the claim of a Shaykh al-Tusi that Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr and his two friends Safwan ibn Yahya and al-Bazanti, when they narrate according to a credible source, an authentic source, a trustworthy source. So whenever we find the name of an individual that Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr relied on, we can consider that person as thiqah, credible. Now, question. Some might question this theory and say, well, Shaykh al-Tusi, when he tells us this, that the Shia, they accept the Maraseel of Ibn Abi Umayr. And why do they accept? Because they know that when he narrates, he only relies on someone who is trustworthy. Shaykh al-Tusi, how do we know that he's saying this because he saw the Shia do such a thing? Maybe this is his ijtihad. Maybe this is according to his own reasoning, not because he witnessed the Shia. In other words, when he's telling us this is based on his hads, his ijtihad, his reasoning. not based on his testimony, shahada. And there's a difference, because a mujtahid cannot rely on the ijtihad of another mujtahid. A mujtahid has to have his own reasoning. He cannot rely on the reasoning of another mujtahid. Unless he relies on the testimony of another mujtahid, yes. But he cannot rely on the ijtihad of another mujtahid. So this is a problem. But this can be solved. Why? Because not narrating from unreliable sources, this is not, this is not something special. There are several narrators, several companions that are known to not rely on people that are inauthentic or unreliable. They only narrate a narration if the source is reliable. So this is not something special, that is only based on these three individuals. No, there are others that, as we shall see later on in this course, there are others that were known to have narrated only based on reliable sources. So why is it so strange to say, how did Shaykh al-Tusi know that these three individuals, they don't narrate on a source unless that source is reliable? How did the Shaykh al-Ta'ifa know? How did Shaykh al-Tusi know? It's not a big deal, because there are others that also only narrated from reliable sources. This is one. Two, Shaykh al-Tusi is not the only one that made this claim. Najashi also made a similar claim. If you remember from the previous episode, Najashi said, وَلِذَا يَسْكُنُونَ الْأَصْحَابِ إِلَى مَرَاسِيلِ بْنِ أَبِي عُمَيْرٍ, that our companions, then the Maraseel of Nabi Umayr, they accept them. They are rest assured when it comes to the Maraseel of Nabi Umayr. They act upon them. Right? Also, Shaykh al-Tusi, he claimed the ijma' of the Shia on many things. On many things. For example, he said that if a reliable narrator might have a different belief, meaning he's from another school of thought, but he's reliable, we can accept him. For example, if a Sunni narrator who's reliable tells us that Imam al-Sadiq said so and so, just because he's Sunni doesn't mean we should reject his narration. Shaykh al-Tusi says there's an ijma' on this, that the belief of a narrator should not stop us from accepting his narration as long as he's trustworthy and reliable. And we see everyone, they accepted this ijma'. Why do they not accept this ijma'? Shaykh al-Tusi is telling us that the Ta'ifa, there's an ijma', a consensus between the school of thought of Shi'ism, the followers of Ahl Bayt. They accept the narrations of these three individuals, even if they don't tell us who their source is. Whether they tell us or they don't tell us. Why? Because they only narrate from a trustworthy source. If we accept the other ijma' of Shaykh al-Tusi, why can't we accept this ijma' as well? Finally, even if Shaykh al-Tusi is telling us his reasoning, the ijma' that he's telling us is based on his reasoning. At the end of the day, Shaykh al-Tusi is an expert, and we can rely on an expert, especially when it comes to things that we can't have knowledge of. Shaykh al-Tusi is telling us a historical account of the Shia at the time. They accepted the Maraseel of Nabi Umayr. He's an expert. How would I know what the Shia did at that time? What their ijma' was? What was their consensus? Did they rely on this narrator or they didn't rely? I have no other way other than relying on Shaykh al-Tusi, Najashi, and that scholars of that caliber. He's an expert, and we may refer to him. These are the individuals that accepted this theory, and this is their justification. Their justification is that Shaykh al-Tusi is telling us in his Iddah that the ta'ifa, there's an ijma', the ijma' of the school of thought of Shi'ism is that the Maraseel and Masanid of Ibn Abi Umayr are considered one and the same. Why? Because Ibn Abi Umayr, his sources are all reliable. لا يروي ولا يرسل إلا عن الثقة. On the other hand, there are some that rejected this theory. Primarily, Sayyid al-Khoi. Sayyid al-Khoi rejected this theory completely. He says because this is the ijtihad of Shaykh al-Tusi. I'm a mujtahid. And Shaykh al-Tusi is a mujtahid. How can a mujtahid rely? Of course, he doesn't say this. He doesn't say, I'm a mujtahid. But he says, Shaykh al-Tusi is a mujtahid. This is his ijtihad. This is his reasoning. Well, why should I accept the reasoning of Shaykh al-Tusi? He might be wrong. This is not a testimony. There's a difference between a reasoning and a testimony. Testimony is based on senses, when you see something or hear something. Reasoning is when you build clues, right? When you see something or hear something, most likely you're right, unless there's a problem with your senses. But when you're building clues, the chances of being mistaken are a lot more than the chances of being mistaken in a testimony. Sayyid al-Khoi says this is the ijtihad of Shaykh al-Tusi. How could we rely on his ijtihad? Right? So he says this in Mu'jam Rijal al-Hadith. In his Al-Tanqih, Sayyid al-Khoi says that in fact we know that Ibn Abi Umayr, he did rely on unauthentic and unreliable sources. There are about 5 to 7 of his sources, they are unreliable. So how can you say that all of his sources are reliable? How can you accept his Masanid? How can you accept his Maraseel? Masanid, well, we'll see that individual. He says, I relate this narration from so-and-so, from Imam. We'll go and look in the books of biographies regarding that individual. If he's been scarred, we'll drop him. Otherwise, maybe we could accept. But with Maraseel, we don't even know who the source is. And we know for a fact that Ibn Abi Umayr, out of the 400 sources that he relied on, 7 of them are inauthentic. 7 of them are unreliable. So when he mentions a mursal, he doesn't tell us who the source is. There's a chance that he could be someone who's unreliable. Hence, Sayyid al-Khoi rejected this theory completely. And he further brings proof and evidence to his theory. He says, none of the former scholars, they said that Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr and his 2 friends, their Masanid and their Maraseel are equivalent. None of them said this, except Al-Kishi, Al-Shaykh Al-Tusi, and Al-Najashi. Other than these 3, no one said that the Maraseel and Masanid of Ibn Abi Umayr are the same. And that Ibn Abi Umayr and his 2 friends, Safwan ibn Yahya and Al-Bazanti, when they narrate from a reliable source. No one other than these 3 scholars. But the answer is that these 3 scholars are enough. These are the 3 major scholars of Rijal. Isn't it not enough for these 3 scholars to believe in such a thing? Al-Kishi, Al-Shaykh Al-Tusi, and Al-Najashi. This is 1. 2, who other scholars do you want? How many books from the former period reached us? Not many. First of all, many of the scholars from the formative period, they didn't author. Or they authored, but it didn't reach us. So how can we know their opinions? This is a problem. Also, Sayyid al-Khoi, he doesn't really care about ijma'. He doesn't care about consensus of the scholars of the formative period. Sayyid al-Khoi says that I rely on my own ijtihad. I will not rely on the ijtihad of any other scholars, even if it's the scholars of the formative period, the early jurists, even if they all gathered and, you know, they there's a consensus among them. Sayyid al-Khoi says they're jurists and I'm a jurist. And a jurist cannot rely on the reasoning of another jurist. He cannot rely on the ijtihad of another jurist. If this is the case, then why would Sayyid al-Khoi care whether other scholars of the formative period, they accepted the Maraseel ibn Abi Umayr or they didn't? Because based on his theories in Usul al-Fiqh, it doesn't make a difference for him. It doesn't make a difference for him. Also, Sayyid al-Khoi, regarding Tafsir al-Qummi, regarding Tafsir Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi, he accepted the mass authentication in Tafsir al-Qummi, as we mentioned in previous episodes. Despite the fact that none of the former scholars, the scholars from the former period, none of them mentioned that Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi authenticates his sources. But why is it now, here in Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr, he's asking for the opinion of the scholars of the formative period? There he didn't care for the opinion of the scholars of the formative period. But now he's asking for their opinion. He's saying that none of them said the Maraseel and Masanid of Ibn Abi Umayr are one and the same. So this was the first evidence that Sayyid al-Khoi mentioned, or first argument, and this is its rebuttal. Another argument that Sayyid al-Khoi mentions is that Shaykh al-Tusi himself, in two other books of his, Al-Tahdhib and Al-Istibsar, he mentions narrations by Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr that are mursal, meaning Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr does not mention his source. He directly attributes the hadith to the Imam without mentioning his source. Shaykh al-Tusi says this is a khabar mursal and it is not accepted. Shaykh al-Tusi himself, the founder of this theory, the theory of Hujjiyat Maraseel ibn Abi Umayr, in which he mentions in his book Al-Udda, but in two of his other books of fiqh, Al-Tahdhib and Istibsar, he rejects the narrations of Ibn Abi Umayr that are Maraseel when he does not mention his source. So how can we accept a theory in which its own founder does not accept? But we could also provide an answer to this argument. One is that Kitab al-Udda, it was written after Al-Tahdhib and Al-Istibsar. And there's a big chance that Shaykh al-Tusi, he changed his mind. First, he did not accept the Maraseel of Ibn Abi Umayr, and then, based on his research, based on some clues that he found, based on, his understanding, or based on books that he came across, he discovered that no, the Maraseel of Ibn Abi Umayr are Hujjah, and that any narrator or transmitter that Ibn Abi Umayr relies on, that person has to be reliable. Maybe this is a theory that developed later on, and this is very much possible because Al-Udda, his book Al-Udda, was written after Al-Tahdhib and Al-Istibsar. And generally speaking, if you find an author with contradictory views and you want to see what was his last theory, what was the thing that he accepted at the end of his life, you'll refer to the book that he wrote last. You won't look at the book that he wrote in his early days, but the book that he wrote in his last days. That is the opinion that he accepted finally. And if we were to apply that to Shaykh al-Tusi authored Al-Udda after At-Tahdhib and Al-Istibsar. And several scholars testify to this fact, namely Sayyid Muhammad Rida al-Sistani, Shaykh al-Subhani. They all testify that Al-Udda was written after At-Tahdhib and Al-Istibsar. This is one. Two, another possibility, and this possibility has been mentioned by Sayyid al-Hakim, Sayyid Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, hafidhahullah, is that sometimes scholars, they mention one thing in usul but they don't apply it in fiqh. Al-Udda is a book of usul al-fiqh. Al-Tahdhib and Al-Istibsar are books of fiqh. And a lot of times, scholars, they mention a theory in usul, but they don't implement it and put it in practice in fiqh. Let this case be, let's apply this to the case of Shaykh al-Tusi. Shaykh al-Tusi theorizes in his usul that Ibn Abi Umayr only narrates from someone who's reliable, but in fiqh he did not implement this theory. This is possible. This is a second solution. A third solution has been mentioned by other scholars, namely As-Sayyid namely As-Sayyid al-Sistani, is that in At-Tahdhib, namely in Al-Istibsar, by Shaykh al-Tusi. Shaykh al-Tusi, the title of Al-Istibsar فيما اختلف من الآثار. The book was written to solve the contradictions between the narrations. Contradictory narrations. One narration says this, another narration says that. They're contradictory. And in Shaykh al-Tusi, he wants to solve the contradiction by mentioning any way of either solving the contradiction or choosing one narration over the other. So one of his ways is saying that this khabar is musnad. We know the chain of narrators. This khabar is mursal. We don't know the chain of narrators, so we choose the musnad over the mursal. Right? It might not be his belief. It might not be his belief at the end of the day, but he wants to resolve the contradiction, even if it means eradicating a mursal and choosing a musnad. So this could be another solution, right? Even if that reasoning he doesn't accept it, but he's trying to convince others that there are no contradictions between the narrations, because this is musnad, that is mursal, even if the mursal was Ibn Abi Umayr. Even if he might not be convinced, but he's trying to convince others that we do not have contradictory narrations. طيب. Another argument put forward by Sayyid al-Khoi is that, okay, Shaykh al-Tusi says that the Ta'ifa, that the school of thought, they accepted the Maraseel of Ibn Abi Umayr and the Masanid of Ibn Abi Umayr. They consider the Masanid and Maraseel of Ibn Abi Umayr to be one and the same, because Ibn Abi Umayr does not narrate lest the source is reliable. He says, well, perhaps the Shia at the time, they accepted any narration by a Shi'i by default, even if they don't know if he's reliable. Unless he's proven to be unreliable, they reject. But if the author, the narrator, is Shi'i, and we don't know is he reliable or not, perhaps the Shia at the time, they would accept his narrations. But this is incorrect. This argument put forward is incorrect. Why? Because we know why the Shia relied on the narrations of Ibn Abi Umayr. Not because they relied on any narration as long as the narrator is Shi'i and we don't know if he's reliable or unreliable. Shaykh al-Tusi is telling us the reason. He says the Shia at the time relied on the narrations of Ibn Abi Umayr because they know he only relies on reliable transmitters. We don't need to, make justifications as to why the Shia relied on these narrations. No, because we already know the reason. Another argument put forward by Sayyid al-Khoi is that these three individuals, Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr, Safwan ibn Yahya, and al-Bazanti, they themselves did not say we only narrate from reliable sources. So how can anyone else know? The answer is that we don't need them to say. But those who were contemporaries to them, their companions, their friends, they know from their akhlaq, from their seerah, from the way they tell stories and the way they narrate, they know that they only rely on trustworthy and reliable sources. And we give an example in the previous episode that I, having lived with my father for so many years, I know that he only relies on reliable sources. And you would know the same thing about your parents and your friends. This is something very common. It's something very possible. My father doesn't need to say, I only narrate stories from reliable sources. But I know from his behavior that that's what he does. طيب. The most important argument put forward by Sayyid al-Khoi is that, in fact, we do know that Ibn Abi Umayr and his two friends, they narrated from unreliable sources. For example, like Ali ibn Abi Hamza, like Abi Jamila, like Ibn Dhibyan, and others who we know for a fact are unreliable. So what do you have to say about that? And he mentions a major list of names of people that could have been unreliable. Right? Where Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr, about 7 of his sources are unreliable. Ibn Safwan ibn Yahya, he also relies on certain individuals that are unreliable, and the same goes for al-Bazanti. This is the argument. However, we can say that this argument could also be refuted. Why? Because those 7 or 6 or 5 individuals that Sayyid al-Khoi says they are unreliable for sure, so we can't accept the theory. Perhaps Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr did not believe they are unreliable. Perhaps he believed that they are reliable. And the same goes for Safwan ibn Yahya and Bazanti. So just because Sayyid al-Khoi or others deem them as unreliable, these 3 individuals, Safwan, Ibn Abi Umayr and al-Bazanti, they deem them as reliable. So this is 1. 2, we can argue this, let alone what Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr and his 2 friends believe. Those individuals, those 7 individuals regarding Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr and other individuals that Safwan ibn Yahya narrated from and al-Bazanti narrated from, maybe a total of 18 individuals. We can argue that they are reliable. By examining their biographies, we can see that there's no reason to believe they are unreliable. Yes, perhaps Sayyid al-Khoi believes they are unreliable and da'if. But having examined their biographies, we can say that they are reliable. Another solution mentioned by Sayyid al-Hakim is that even if those 18 individuals are unreliable, perhaps Ibn Abi Umayr, Safwan and al-Bazanti, when they narrated from them, they narrated from them the days that they were reliable. Because those transmitters, perhaps one day they were reliable, and then towards the end of their lives they became unreliable. So when those 3 individuals, they narrated from them when they were reliable, before they became munharif, before they became da'if. This is very much possible. And that's fine, as long as we know that this narration came from that individual when he was reliable, when he was trustworthy, and then he became a liar. We could still accept his narration, because it was stated by him the days that he was reliable, not the days that he became a liar. This is another argument. Another argument is by Shaykh al-Sanad, Shaykh Muhammad al-Sanad, one of our teachers in Najaf. He says that Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr, when he narrates from a narrator, this is a testimony, a practical testimony that individual is reliable. But when other scholars that came later on, like An-Najashi and Shaykh al-Tusi, they say, for example, that individual is unreliable, that's a verbal testimony. Which is stronger, a practical testimony or a verbal testimony? Obviously a practical. And which is stronger, a testimony by a person who's contemporary of those narrators, or someone who came 100 years later? Obviously their contemporary, his testimony is more reliable than someone who came later on. طيب. Another argument that we could put forward against Sayyid al-Khoi is that Sayyid al-Khoi here rejects the ijma' of Shaykh al-Tusi. He says the ijma' of Shaykh al-Tusi here, saying that the Ta'ifa, they accept the Maraseel ibn Abi Umayr. This is based on his ijtihad. While we see that Sayyid al-Khoi, he accepts the ijma' of Shaykh al-Tusi in other places. For example, there's a narrator by the name of As-Sukuni. As-Sukuni, there's a debate. Is he reliable or unreliable? Sayyid al-Khoi says he's reliable. Why? Because Shaykh al-Tusi, in his Al-Adda, he says As-Sukuni is reliable. Although he's Sunni, but because he's trustworthy, the Shia, they accept his narrations. And Sayyid al-Khoi accepts the narrations of As-Sukuni based on the ijma' of Shaykh al-Tusi. We ask Sayyid al-Khoi that if you accept the ijma' of Shaykh al-Tusi regarding As-Sukuni, why can't you accept it regarding Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr and his two colleagues? Right? We will stop here and we will continue the discussion on Ibn Abi Umayr in the coming episodes, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.